At the heart of the seemingly idyllic community of Stonebridge stood the Lawrence residence, a grand symbol of stability and respectability. The Lawrence sisters, Isolda and Celeste, were well known in the neighborhood, admired for their intelligence and the close bond they shared. Isolda, the elder by 2 years, was a sharp and ambitious corporate lawyer, known for her strategic mind and meticulous approach to life. Her achievements were a source of pride, not just for herself, but for the entire Lawrence family, whose name had long been synonymous with success in Stonebridge. Celeste, on the other hand, was the embodiment of artistic freedom. A free-spirited painter, she was everything her sister was not: impulsive, creative, and deeply passionate about the world around her. Her art, which adorned galleries across the region, was a vibrant reflection of her inner world, full of color and emotion. Celeste's presence was magnetic. People were drawn to her warmth and her ability to make them see the beauty in the ordinary. Together, the sisters were a formidable pair, their contrasting personalities balancing each other out, creating a dynamic that was both admired and envied by those around them. However, beneath this veneer of harmony, dark currents were beginning to stir. The sisters, who had once been inseparable, began to drift apart as their differences grew more pronounced. Isolda's rigid adherence to the traditional values of their upbringing clashed with Celeste's increasingly radical views on social justice. What was once a harmonious relationship began to fray at the edges, as each sister became more entrenched in her own beliefs. The once unbreakable bond that had defined their lives now seemed fragile, threatened by the very differences that had once made them stronger together. As their lives continued to diverge, the tension between them grew, fed by a series of events that would ultimately lead to a tragic confrontation. What began as a simple disagreement over dinner conversations soon escalated into a full-blown ideological battle, with each sister determined to stand her ground. The Lawrence residence, once a symbol of unity and strength, became a battleground where long-simmering resentments and unresolved conflicts came to the fore. And in the end, it would be this tension, this unyielding clash of values, that would set the stage for the unthinkable: a sister's decision to take the life of her own flesh and blood. Stonebridge had always prided itself on being a welcoming and progressive community, a town where tradition and modernity coexisted in a delicate balance. The manicured lawns, historic homes, and tree-lined streets painted a picture of idyllic suburban life. But beneath this polished exterior lay unspoken rules and expectations that governed the behavior of its residents. For years, the Lawrence family had been a cornerstone of this community, their influence stretching back generations. The family's wealth, combined with their long-standing reputation for upholding the town's values, placed them at the very heart of Stonebridge society. However, the arrival of Celeste's new boyfriend, Marcus, began to shake the foundations of this carefully maintained equilibrium. Marcus was a passionate advocate for social justice, unafraid to speak out against the injustices he saw in the world around him. His presence in Celeste's life brought a new energy to her art, pushing her to explore themes of race, privilege, and inequality with a fervor that was both inspiring and unsettling. Under Marcus's influence, Celeste's work took on a more provocative tone, challenging the comfortable norms of Stonebridge and forcing its residents to confront issues they would rather ignore. For Isolda, these changes in her sister were more than just unsettling. They were a direct threat to the life she had carefully constructed. Isolda had always been comfortable with the status quo, believing that tradition and stability were the keys to success. She viewed the world in black and white, with little room for the shades of gray that Celeste seemed to embrace so readily. The more Celeste became involved in activism, the more Isolda felt her sister was abandoning the values they had been raised with. What Isolda saw as harmless rhetoric, Celeste embraced as a call to action, leading to increasingly heated debates between the two. The tension between the sisters spilled over into their social circles, as friends and neighbors began to take sides. Stonebridge, which had always prided itself on being a close-knit community, found itself divided by the growing rift between the Lawrence sisters. The once harmonious gatherings where Isolda and Celeste were seen as the perfect complement to each other, became fraught with underlying tension. The community, which had always looked up to the Lawrence family as a model of unity and success, began to whisper about the changes they saw in Celeste and the strain it was placing on her relationship with Isolda. As the months passed, the once close sisters found themselves living in two different worlds. Isolda, ever the pragmatist, doubled down on her efforts to maintain the family's reputation, immersing herself in her work and community involvement. Celeste, driven by her passion for justice, became increasingly isolated from the traditional circles that had once embraced her. She found solace in her art and in the company of those who shared her views, but the distance between her and Isolda grew wider with each passing day. The town of Stonebridge, once a symbol of unity and stability, had become a reflection of the deep divisions that now defined the lives of the Lawrence sisters. The tension between the sisters began innocently enough, with debates over dinner about race and privilege. These discussions, though heated, were initially seen as a healthy exchange of ideas, a way for the sisters to challenge each other and grow. But as time went on, the debates became more personal, with each sister becoming increasingly entrenched in her own beliefs. Isolda, who had always been comfortable with the status quo, was increasingly irritated by Celeste's new worldview. She saw her sister's activism as a threat to the stability and order that she had worked so hard to maintain. Celeste, on the other hand, felt that her sister's refusal to engage with the issues of the day was a sign of willful ignorance. She saw Isolda's commitment to tradition as a form of complicity in the very systems of oppression she was fighting against. The once unbreakable bond between them started to fray as Isolda's discomfort with Celeste's activism turned into something far more sinister. What had started as a series of intellectual disagreements became a battleground for their very identities, with each sister feeling that the other was trying to undermine everything she stood for. As the arguments became more frequent and intense, a dark resentment began to fester within Isolda. She found herself questioning everything about her sister, from her motives to her relationships. In Isolda's eyes, Celeste was becoming a threat, not only to their family's reputation, but to the life Isolda had worked so hard to build. Celeste's passion, which once seemed like a charming eccentricity, now appeared to Isolda as a dangerous obsession. The ideological rift between them deepened, and Isolda's initial irritation transformed into a cold, calculating hatred. She couldn't stand the idea that her sister's activism might expose and challenge the very prejudices that Isolda had never fully confronted within herself. As their relationship deteriorated, Isolda's resentment turned into a dangerous obsession. She began to see Celeste not just as a rival for the family's legacy, but as an enemy who needed to be silenced. Isolda's paranoia grew as she became increasingly convinced that Celeste's activism was a direct attack on everything she had worked for. She began to plot ways to undermine her sister, using her legal expertise to manipulate situations to her advantage. She spread rumors, questioned Celeste's mental stability, and planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had once been close to her. But as Isolda's actions became more calculated, so too did her hatred for her sister. Celeste, for her part, was not oblivious to what was happening. She noticed the subtle shifts in people's attitudes towards her, the way once friendly faces now looked at her with suspicion. The realization that her own sister was behind these efforts to undermine her was devastating. For Celeste, this was not just a betrayal. It was an attack on everything she stood for. The ideological battle that had started as a series of heated debates had now become a full-blown war, with each sister determined to destroy the other in order to protect what she believed in. As the conflict between them escalated, it became clear that there was no turning back. The sisters, who had once been inseparable, were now locked in a battle that could only end in tragedy. The ideological differences that had once been a source of lively debate had become a chasm that could never be bridged. Each sister, blinded by her own convictions, was willing to go to any lengths to protect her beliefs, even if it meant destroying the one person she had always held dear. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the lives of everyone involved, leaving a community in shock and a family torn apart by hatred and betrayal. The breaking point came one evening during a family dinner. Marcus and Celeste had just returned from a protest, exhilarated by the energy and sense of purpose they felt. Isolda, tired from a long day at work, was in no mood for what she saw as self-righteous lecturing. The conversation quickly escalated into a fierce argument. Celeste accused Isolda of being complicit in systemic racism, while Isolda, her composure cracking, retorted that Celeste was naive and out of touch with reality. The tension that had been building for months finally boiled over, with each sister unleashing years of pent-up frustration and anger. In a fit of anger, Isolda spat out words she would later regret. "You and your kind are the real problem." The room fell silent as the weight of her statement hung in the air. Celeste, shocked and deeply hurt, left the house in tears, vowing never to speak to her sister again. The words, once spoken, could never be taken back, and the damage they caused was irreparable. For Celeste, Isolda's outburst was a confirmation of everything she had feared, that her sister's refusal to engage with issues of race and privilege was rooted in deep-seated prejudice. In the days that followed, Isolda became consumed by a toxic mix of guilt and rage. The thought of Celeste and Marcus, growing closer and more determined in their cause, gnawed at her. Isolda began to see her sister not just as a rival, but as a threat to everything she had worked for. Her discomfort with Celeste's activism morphed into a deep-seated resentment that festered and grew. Determined to silence her sister once and for all, Isolda meticulously crafted a plan. Drawing on her legal knowledge, she began researching ways to make Celeste's death appear accidental. Isolda's obsession with her sister's downfall consumed her every waking moment. She spent hours poring over legal cases, looking for ways to cover her tracks. She considered various methods, each more sinister than the last, before finally settling on the idea of a staged accident during one of Celeste's solo hikes. Isolda knew her sister's routines well. She knew when Celeste would be most vulnerable, and she planned to exploit that vulnerability to the fullest. Her meticulous nature, which had served her so well in her career, was now being used to plan a murder. As the day of the planned accident approached, Isolda's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. She could barely eat or sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of what she was about to do. But despite the fear and anxiety, she remained resolute in her decision. To her, this was the only way to protect everything she had worked for. In her twisted reasoning, she convinced herself that Celeste's death would be a mercy, a way to save her sister from herself, and to save the family from further disgrace. On the morning of the planned hike, Isolda's resolve was tested to its limit. As she watched Celeste prepare for her walk, chatting casually with Marcus as if nothing was amiss, Isolda felt a pang of doubt. But that doubt was quickly overshadowed by the cold, calculating voice in her head that reminded her of what was at stake. She had come too far to turn back now. As Celeste left the house, unaware of the danger that awaited her, Isolda steeled herself for what was to come. The plan was set in motion, and there was no stopping it now. In the days that followed, Isolda became consumed by a toxic mix of guilt and rage. The thought of Celeste and Marcus, growing closer and more determined in their cause, gnawed at her. Isolda began to see her sister not just as a rival, but as a threat to everything she had worked for. Her discomfort with Celeste's activism morphed into a deep-seated resentment that festered and grew. Determined to silence her sister once and for all, Isolda meticulously crafted a plan. Drawing on her legal knowledge, she began researching ways to make Celeste's death appear accidental. Isolda's obsession with her sister's downfall consumed her every waking moment. She spent hours poring over legal cases, looking for ways to cover her tracks. She considered various methods, each more sinister than the last, before finally settling on the idea of a staged accident during one of Celeste's solo hikes. Isolda knew her sister's routines well. She knew when Celeste would be most vulnerable, and she planned to exploit that vulnerability to the fullest. Her meticulous nature, which had served her so well in her career, was now being used to plan a murder. Isolda's planning was meticulous and thorough, driven by a chilling determination to rid herself of the one person she saw as a threat to her carefully curated life. She began by studying Celeste's daily routines, taking note of the exact times and locations of her solitary hikes. Under the guise of concern for her sister's safety, Isolda even joined Celeste on a few of these hikes, using the opportunity to observe her behavior and identify potential weaknesses. Every detail was logged in Isolda's mind, as she methodically constructed a plan that would leave no room for error. Next, Isolda turned her attention to the technical aspects of her plan. She spent hours researching various methods to stage an accident, focusing on ways to ensure that the cause of death would appear entirely natural. She scoured medical journals, studying the effects of various toxins that could be used to incapacitate her sister without leaving a trace. She also looked into the topography of the hiking trails, identifying the most treacherous spots where a fall could easily be explained as a tragic accident. Isolda's background in law gave her a unique insight into how investigators would approach the case, and she used this knowledge to meticulously cover her tracks. Isolda also began laying the groundwork for her alibi. She made sure to be seen around town in the days leading up to the planned hike, attending social events and volunteering for community projects. She even reached out to Celeste, inviting her to dinner and attempting to mend a rift between them. This was all part of her carefully crafted narrative. Isolda, the loving sister, trying to reconcile with her wayward sibling. To those around her, it appeared that Isolda was making a genuine effort to repair their relationship, but in reality, she was setting the stage for the perfect crime. As the day of the planned accident approached, Isolda's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. She could barely eat or sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of what she was about to do. But despite the fear and anxiety, she remained resolute in her decision. To her, this was the only way to protect everything she had worked for. In her twisted reasoning, she convinced herself that Celeste's death would be a mercy, a way to save her sister from herself and to save the family from further disgrace. On the morning of the planned hike, Isolda's resolve was tested to its limit. As she watched Celeste prepare for her walk, chatting casually with Marcus as if nothing was amiss, Isolda felt a pang of doubt. But that doubt was quickly overshadowed by the cold, calculating voice in her head that reminded her of what was at stake. She had come too far to turn back now. As Celeste left the house, unaware of the danger that awaited her, Isolda steeled herself for what was to come. The plan was set in motion, and there was no stopping it now. On a crisp autumn morning, Isolda put her plan into action. She knew that Celeste often went for long hikes in the nearby woods to clear her mind. That day, Isolda followed her sister, keeping a careful distance. As Celeste reached a particularly treacherous part of the trail, Isolda made her move. She tampered with the path, scattering leaves over a hidden drop-off, and then waited in the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched her sister approach, each step bringing her closer to the moment that would change their lives forever. When Celeste approached, lost in thought, she stepped on the unstable ground. She lost her footing and tumbled down the steep embankment, her cries echoing through the trees. Isolda watched in cold detachment as her sister lay motionless at the bottom, before quickly leaving the scene to establish her alibi. As she walked away, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that her plan had succeeded, but also a deep, gnawing emptiness that she could not explain. Isolda had expected to feel triumphant, but instead, she was left with a hollow sense of loss. Isolda's next move was crucial. She returned home, taking care to be seen by neighbors and friends along the way. She made a point of stopping by the local market, chatting with the shopkeeper about the upcoming community fair. Every interaction was carefully calculated to create a timeline that would place her far from the scene of the accident. Once home, Isolda settled into her routine, making phone calls and responding to emails, all the while keeping an eye on the clock. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone discovered Celeste's body. When the call finally came, Isolda played her part to perfection. She feigned shock and disbelief, her voice trembling as she asked for details. She rushed to the scene, her face a mask of grief as she saw her sister's lifeless body being carried away by the paramedics. To those around her, Isolda's sorrow seemed genuine. After all, who could believe that a sister would be capable of such a heinous act? But inside, Isolda was already calculating her next move, making sure that every detail of her plan had been executed flawlessly. In the days that followed, Isolda maintained her composure, even as the weight of what she had done began to press down on her. She attended Celeste's funeral, accepting condolences from friends and family with a stoic grace that belied the darkness within. She took on the role of the grieving sister, handling the arrangements for Celeste's estate and sorting through her belongings with a calm efficiency. But beneath the surface, Isolda was haunted by what she had done. Every night, as she lay in bed, she replayed the events of that fateful day over and over in her mind, each time hoping to find some justification for her actions. But as the days turned into weeks, Isolda's carefully constructed facade began to crack. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone would discover the truth. She started to see Celeste's face everywhere, in the reflections of windows, in the shadows of her home, even in her dreams. The guilt that had once been a small, nagging presence in the back of her mind began to consume her until she could no longer escape it. Isolda had thought that by killing her sister, she could rid herself of the threat to her life and reputation. But instead, she had only created a prison of her own making, one from which there was no escape. Celeste's death was ruled a tragic accident, and the community mourned the loss of a beloved artist and activist. Isolda played the part of the grieving sister perfectly, her stoic demeanor masking the darkness within. However, her carefully constructed facade began to crumble when Marcus, suspicious of the circumstances surrounding Celeste's death, started his own investigation. Marcus had always been wary of Isolda, sensing a coldness in her that others seemed to overlook. But now, his suspicions grew into something more, a determination to uncover the truth. It wasn't long before Marcus uncovered inconsistencies in Isolda's story. His persistence led the authorities to re-examine the case, and eventually, the truth came to light. Evidence of Isolda's meticulous planning surfaced, and she was arrested, her true nature exposed to the horrified community of Stonebridge. The arrest sent shockwaves through the town, shattering the carefully maintained image of the Lawrence family and forcing everyone to confront the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. As the investigation unfolded, more details of Isolda's plan came to light, painting a chilling picture of a woman consumed by jealousy and hatred. The community, which had once looked up to the Lawrence sisters as paragons of success and virtue, was left reeling. The revelation that Isolda, the respected lawyer and upstanding citizen, had meticulously plotted her own sister's death was almost too much to bear. Friends and neighbors who had once admired her now struggled to reconcile the image of the woman they thought they knew with the cold-blooded killer that had been revealed. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with every detail of the case dissected in the press. Isolda's defense team tried to paint her as a woman driven to the edge by the pressures of her life, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The prosecution laid out the details of her plan in chilling detail, from the careful research into toxins to the meticulous construction of her alibi. The jury, horrified by the cold calculation behind Isolda's actions, took less than a day to reach a verdict, guilty on all counts. Isolda was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that many in the community felt was too lenient for the crime she had committed. As she was led away in handcuffs, the mask of the grieving sister fell away completely, revealing the true extent of the darkness that had consumed her. The once respected lawyer was now a pariah, shunned by the very community that had once held her in such high esteem. In the aftermath of the trial, Stonebridge was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered community. The Lawrence family's fall from grace was swift and devastating, with Isolda's parents retreating from public life in shame. Marcus, though heartbroken by the loss of Celeste, became a vocal advocate for justice, using his experience to raise awareness about the dangers of unchecked prejudice and hatred. Celeste's legacy as an artist and activist lived on, her work gaining new recognition in the wake of her death. But for those who had known the Lawrence sisters, the memory of what had happened would forever cast a shadow over the once idyllic town. In the end, Isolda's attempt to silence her sister only served to amplify the very message she sought to suppress. Celeste's legacy as an advocate for justice lived on, while Isolda, stripped of her former respectability, faced life in prison for her heinous crime. The tragic tale of the Lawrence sisters stands as a stark reminder of the destructive power of hatred and the lengths to which some will go to protect their own prejudices. Stonebridge, once a symbol of unity and stability, was now a community forever marked by the darkness that had lurked beneath its surface, a darkness that had ultimately led one sister to kill another in a desperate bid to silence the truth. The story of the Lawrence sisters serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the closest of bonds can be shattered by the corrosive effects of hatred and bigotry. It is a story of how deeply ingrained prejudices can tear families apart, and how the pursuit of power and control can lead to the most unimaginable of crimes. In the end, Isolda's attempts to protect her life and reputation led to her own downfall, as the very action she took to silence her sister became the means by which her true nature was revealed. The legacy of the Lawrence family, once a source of pride for the community, was now a testament to the destructive power of unchecked hatred and the devastating consequences it can have.